Hello, sir. Hello, Gagan, sir.
Yeah, Tavishi, yes.
How are
We
you,
have
sir?
fine, Tavishi. We have Mr. Rao with us.
Yeah, hi. Except that I'm using another friend's machine because I'm not at home. So you'll have to bear with me. I'm using Uday, but
That's all
I haven't changed my identity as yet. I'll do so after today.
Right. No problem.
okay, sir. So, sir, we'll wait for just a couple of minutes
Sure.
and then begin with the event.
We have Yeah, Tavishi. Yes. Hello.
Okay, so we'll be starting.
Sure.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tavishi Jain, member of DUSU Legal Cell and a second-year law student of Delhi University. I would like to welcome our viewers and distinguished panelists for today's DUSU Legal Cell webinar on decriminalization of economic offences. We have Bar and Bench as our media partner. We are really grateful for Pallavi ma'am for being on board with us and supporting us. We are highly privileged to have with us today as our speakers Mr. Rajshekhar Rao and Mr. Gagan Gandhi, sir. Rajshekhar sir is an alumnus of National Law School of India, University, Bangalore, where he received Golden Medal for the Best Student Advocate and for International Law. He is a member of Bar Council of Delhi, Delhi High Court Bar Association, and the Supreme Court Bar Association. He has been an independent legal practitioner since 2006 at Supreme Court of India, High Court Delhi, and many others with a wide range of matters. He has worked at the chambers of Ms. Indu Malhotra, who was then advocate on record and is presently judge at the Supreme Court of India. He has also worked at chambers of Mr. Gopal Subramaniam, where he was involved in matters involving a wide range of laws across various high courts. Sir was also appointed as the junior prosecuting counsel to represent government of National Capital Territory of Delhi in the hearing of Parliament attack case before the Supreme Court of India. He was the panel advocate for Union of India from 2003 to 2008, and he has played a pivotal role as the special prosecutor on behalf of Enforcement Directorate in the 2G money laundering scam. We're truly honored to have you, sir, for today's event. We have Gagan Gandhi, sir, who has graduated in mathematics and statistics from St. Stephen's College. He completed his management from Faculty of Management Studies, University of Delhi. He has worked in American Express Private Limited in their Risk and Information Department before he decided to pursue law from Faculty of Law, University of Delhi. He has research papers to his credit in the Journal of Management Research. He is the managing partner of Niti Nyay Law Offices, where he deals with cases of check dishonor, probate, succession, partition, and possession, uh, recovery suits, commercial suits, service matters, writ petitions, both civil and criminal, and pro bono litigation. Thank you so much for joining us today. I would like to invite our panelists for this event now and have the viewpoints on our topic for today, which is decriminalization of economic offenses. With this, I would like to begin with a question that we have amidst us. Why do you think, sir, is the government wanting to decriminalize certain economic offenses?
Okay, let me start with this and then perhaps Gagan can step in. Tavishi, as you know, the government did come out with these notifications which are proposed, intentions which demonstrate the proposed intent to decriminalize. The stated objective at least appears to be ease of doing business. And more importantly, of course, there is for some strange reason a nexus sought to be drawn into COVID. So I'm just reading from the statement of objects put out by the Ministry of Finance in relation to the first one, which is 8th of June. And it says the risk of imprisonment for actions or omissions that aren't necessarily fraudulent or the outcome of mala fide intent is a big hurdle in attracting investments. So the ensuing uncertainty in legal processes and the time taken for resolution in courts hurts ease of doing business. And then, of course, they say this is also important from a post-COVID response strategy. So it's actually in response to what the government had started out in its election manifesto, try to say that we are going to make it a lot more easier to make investments in India and to obviously encourage investment in India. That seems to be the object. I mean, whether that object ultimately translates into what they've put out and which are the statutes they intend to apply this process to is something that I'm sure we'll discuss over the period of the next 1 hour or so. But this is broadly it. And I think the other issues, of course, it's not stated in the document, but the way I see it is a lot of these are really in respect of very, very minor, infractions. So failure to furnish documents when called upon, failure to file your returns on time, things like that. Now, these are all things that actually can be covered within the regular legal framework. You don't really need to criminalize conduct of this nature. It doesn't help. That's one. And of course, there is the other aspect of the overburdened courts that we already have. So 138 being a case in point, there are similar provisions under the Companies Act where for any compounding, you had to go through, a judicial process. All of those are now sought to be brought into either decriminalized or being made administrative. So it's easier from that perspective. The third aspect, perhaps, and which is something that I have not understood, is what they say is that it would be a significant step in Government of India's objective of achieving Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas and Sabka Vishwas. Now, that's something that I think I will flag for now, and we'll see whether that really works when we look at the intent of the law. So that's really what it is, the way I see it as of now, at least. This is what the government aims to
do. Just adding on to what he said, that the objective behind bringing this legislation and at this point of time, if you look at the series of actions taken by the government over the time, the objective of the government has been to get away with the archaic laws. And if you look at the sections which they want to decriminalize by virtue of this legislation, so a lot of the laws will be taken care by the general laws, that is the IPC and the CRPC. So the government thinks that the machinery is being overburdened by multiplicity of avenues to address the same thing, which can be addressed by IPC or CRPC. Why should it be tackled by a different statute?
So in continuation to the tagline that Rao sir just mentioned, and in continuation to the point that you mentioned as to the burden that the government feels, what exactly do you think is the intent behind this move to decriminalize these economic offenses? Is there some other intent, some other objective that you feel the government has in mind?
Sir, I would like to...
No, is that addressed to Gagan or me? And we'll then respond accordingly. And I think Gagan wants some clarification on that.
The objective which is apparent, as Mr. Rao pointed out, is to declog the already burdened system, to have the ease of doing business. But in whether in the garb of doing all these things, are we going to achieve the real objective? The real objective is actually to get the money. I'm not concerned whether the debtor is put behind bars or not. My main aim is actually that my money, I should get my money back. And we already are moving towards commercial courts. We have improvisation in the Arbitration Act. And keeping this in mind, I don't think that actually decriminalization is going to declog the already clogged system, because it's going to shift the burden from X to burden on Y. And I think Mr. Rao can then elucidate
Right,
more
okay,
about.
just taking a cue from that, Tavishi, I think the question you're asking us is what really is the government, I mean, beyond what is stated in the, in the statement of objects and reasons, is there anything else that the government intends? The way I see it, if I were to just put myself in the shoes of government for a minute, it is really making a statement. And that statement is timely in a sense that India needs to be all the more self-reliant today than ever. And that's the whole point of, the Prime Minister's clarion call of Atmanirbhar Bharat. The short question is, has the government really spelled that out? I mean, there are some paragraphs there, but if you go back historically, the finance minister has made a few statements in the early part of this year. The current government in both its manifestos, both in 14 and 19, has been promising, cleaning up the legal system and making it a lot more investor friendly. So I think just the fact that they made this statement, and you've seen some changes to the Companies Act, there have been amendments whereby certain set of provisions have been decriminalized. They've kind of they've made some provisions more stringent in terms of striking off, etc., etc. All of those are a part of a series of steps taken by the government to try and, bring about a balance in the existing legal framework. So we will, I mean, the way if I were to just speak for government for a minute, it's almost as if they're suggesting that we will go after the big fish and the real things that matter, and the small little things that can either work themselves out in accordance with the ordinary lay of the land or by stricter enforcement. And just taking a cue, for instance, there are some provisions which are sought to be decriminalized, for instance, under the Insurance Act and a couple of other statutes, where the failure to respond and furnish documentation was an offense. Now, frankly, if the authority has the ability to get that information without really asking for it, I mean, suppose there is a provision for search and seizure, or merely because of the fact that you're the authority which licenses periodically inspects, if you have the ability to get that information, what purpose is being served by, effectively saying, I will now hold a sword of Damocles over your head and make sure that you supply. If you don't supply, then I'm going to then make you face a criminal prosecution for something that is essentially compoundable in terms of, I mean, that can be taken care of by a fine or failing to renew your license. So that's really it. I think they're trying to clean up the space to make sure that they can focus on things that matter, given the fact that our system is already burdened and stretched. And this is just the beginning, according to me. You will see a whole lot of things. Like I said, the problems that I see in this notification are perhaps teething troubles, and perhaps, what should I say? It's an experiment that they're trying to push through. But eventually you will find that the idea is to maximize resources and to ensure that they focus on things that really, really count.
So, sir, do you really feel that at the end, since this is basically, as of now, an experimentation, do you feel they will be able to achieve their objectives that they have in mind, say getting more investment and creating a more business-friendly environment and ease of doing business, as they want to point out? Will they be able to achieve it at the end of the day?
Okay, again, tough call, not a clairvoyant, but it's never easy being in government. It's very easy to sit on the outside and say, does 1 + 1 make 2? And I don't think that's perhaps the way to look at it. The question is this. Just take a civil suit. If you had to file a civil suit in the 40s or the 60s or the 90s, and the time that it would take for a civil suit to come to fruition, forget everything else, forget fruition, just to come to the stage of framing of issues and trial. I mean, there are horror stories. You've had instances, at least I've seen instances where a written statement has not been filed for 8, 10 years. So there's no question of even coming to the issue stage. So, but the amendments to the Commercial Courts Act, the amendments to the CPC, the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, and you'll notice that there are even more recent amendments. So something that's been amended in 2015 has been amended in 19 again. These are all indications of the government reacting to the needs of changing times. And frankly, I think that's a growing reflection of a realization that if we don't get our act together right now, we'll be left far behind. We already have this huge problem of, in the 90s, perhaps we were alongside China or maybe a little ahead of China, and suddenly we have been left far behind. And this is the perfect opportunity to kind of make India the place that everybody should be looking at as an alternative. Whereas what seems to be happening is, investments are already being diverted to Vietnam and other jurisdictions. So whether they will achieve their object, time will tell, given the nature of our, population, the population to judge ratio, the limited resources that we have, not the easiest of tasks. But yes, at the end of the day, I believe, okay, I'm an eternal optimist and I believe that we are making progress. So it would be unfair to compare ourselves with anybody else. We have a very, very unique set of circumstances that we are dealing with. But again, what bothers me, for instance, is just since you made that point, if one would just see, the move to decriminalize, say, Section 103 of the Insurance Act, and that's the first item in that 8th June notification. Now, the statute effectively said that if a person carries on business of insurance without obtaining a certificate of registration under Section 3, he shall be liable to a penalty not exceeding 25 crores and with imprisonment which may extend to 10 years. Now, there are three important things. A, you're carrying on the business of insurance without a certificate of registration. That's part one. Part two is you may then be exposed to a penalty of up to 25 crores. And thirdly, and with imprisonment, which may extend to 10 years. Now, I believe that this was good legislation. It was meant to cater to a situation where somebody fraudulently set up an insurance business, collected insurance premiums from people, on the street, with the understanding that tomorrow when they suffered a loss, they would be compensated. But when it comes down to decriminalizing, suddenly the state believes that this is something that is not in tune with its object of ease of doing business. Now, I don't know if the message that they want to send out is, please come up and set up an insurance company, don't take registration, collect premiums, and then we will deal with you separately. Gagan may be right. You see, the IPC may deal with it. I mean, somebody may be able to file a 420 tomorrow and say, listen, you dishonestly induced me to part with my money without having a certificate of registration. But that's not the message. The IPC is there. If that was the answer, then you didn't need any other statute. The IPC is a principles-based statute legislation which takes care of pretty much all, which to a large extent can cover at least 60 to 80% of all issues that one may face alongside. So it's that same classic example of, I beat somebody up. Now I can go under assault under tort law. I can also then file under the IPC, say for under 323 or 326 as the case may be. But the question is, how does decriminalizing 103 enable the government to meet its object when the government stated object is that the risk of imprisonment for actions or omissions that aren't necessarily fraudulent? If somebody is setting up an insurance business without registration, I mean, I would take it that the foundation itself is fraudulent. I mean, there has to be it's like an absolute liability fraudulent position situation. So that's where we are. So I don't know. I mean, so I think steps in the right direction. These are baby steps for sure. We have a really long way to go. And the fact that, you see the Department of Financial Services comes out with something, then the Department of Economic Affairs is coming out with something else. The Companies Act was tweaked a little recently. So these are all steps. But like I said, eternal optimist. In the long run, I believe this will all clean up. And we will have what I believe is a fair system that works on the ground.
So in continuation to your example, I would also like to ask, for example, you've stated in the said offense, there is a criminal liability as well, there's imprisonment and there's a fine as well. What do you think is the culture behind, say, establishing a law? And do you think they could have, instead of decriminalizing, they could have just removed the criminal part of it, removed the imprisonment part of it, kept the civil punishment, for example, and not kept like an imprisonment if they're talking about decongesting prison, simplifying the system. So what do you think is the culture behind this? What decides this in a particular country?
Okay. Culture, let me put it like this. We belong to a country where Mahatma Gandhi ji said, if somebody slaps you on one cheek, offer him the other. Okay, so the cultural emphasis that India at least puts forth is one of non-violence. Jurisprudentially, there is this huge debate on whether criminalizing any conduct achieves any solutions. So is penalty really the answer to reform? Is penalty the answer to social behavior? And, you know, as a lawmaker, one is always walking a tightrope on that. And that, I mean, for instance, the classic example is death penalty. Does killing somebody who has killed somebody, albeit with the authority of the law, really serve any purpose? Does it stop people from killing people? And or is the attempt of law to be reformative? But I think the point is this, that the object of criminalizing is essentially to react to society. For instance, I mean, if one looks at the Chit Funds Act, which is something that, you know, this legislation again seeks to decriminalize portions of, and the Price Chits Act. Now, these were criminalized, special statutes were brought in after detailed studies were done. And in fact, the Supreme Court in a couple of cases has examined the underlying, you know, social problems that were sought to be remedied by enacting these statutes. Now, there were detailed evaluations, there was statistical analysis, numbers were looked at, and basis that the government in power and parliament decided to enact law to meet a to meet a societal need, or to achieve a particular object insofar as society is concerned. I don't see the same homework being done here. So when you ask me what is the culture, you know, it has to be evident from the law. So perhaps when somebody debates this in parliament and the government is able to, you know, better explain its position, one could get a sense. But the culture seems to be, at least if one were to just read the text of the statute, the culture seems to be right now, we need to do whatever to assure somebody who wants to do business in India that you are reasonably safe, you will not be subjected to unnecessary harassment. But then is decriminalizing the answer? Perhaps not. I mean, should we then make it a point where we become a country where everybody says, okay, I can set up an insurance business in India without registration and I don't need to worry about Section 103 anymore. So I don't have to worry about 25 crores. I don't have to worry about, 10 years of imprisonment. Is that the message we are sending out? So you're right. I mean, perhaps they could have found a balance. They could have said, okay, we will take away the fear of prison, but we will impose deterrence. Can we find provisions where we say, okay, fine, if you violate, then we'll attach all your assets under the price cheat scheme, etc. There are provisions for things like that. So that's the balance. But that's why I'm saying this is such a small statement, and they've given us a few sections. It's not even clear as to why a particular section of a particular statute has been chosen in contrast to something else. So section 29 of the SARFAESI, for instance. So why have you decided to decriminalize 29 of SARFAESI? Is it because there is 25, 26, 27? 28 has already been deleted in the previous instance in 2016 or so. So that discussion is not evident. And that's why, I mean, I think, my wife keeps telling me, and this is a constant line that I keep telling my colleagues, the secret to a successful marriage is communication. So similarly, for a government to, ensure that it and the population are on the same page, it has to communicate, and it has to communicate well. The problem is we have a lot of talk, but there is no real communication. And this is another instance of that, at least the way I see it.
I would like to address,
Tabishi, this question brings me back to the age-old question of jurisprudence, as Mr. Rao was talking about, that whether incarceration actually puts a checks on the recidivism or not. Now, the objective of punishment is threefold, which is retribution, rehabilitation, and deterrence. Now, if I compare culturally, you look at Saudi Arabia, you have to steal something, your fingers are chopped off. You will not find a third time offender in Saudi Arabia. But does that lead that India should also adopt that kind of culture where if somebody steals something, then his fingers are chopped off? So that's a debate actually, that whether stricter laws actually leads to more enforcement or whether stricter laws leads to less compliance. So that has to be seen. So this is a trade-off actually, as rightly put out by Mr. Rao, that whether you want to loosen out the compliances to attract more investment, or whether you want to make it more stricter so that one is afraid of actually investing in India. So that this is the question which government needs to answer. And in fact, there was a very landmark case in Michigan where somebody steals a signboard, and then the jury actually made it lifetime imprisonment. And after that, there was no stealing of signage boards in the state of Michigan. But does that mean that India should also adopt that kind of culture where there is no room for rehabilitation?
So continuing with your point, Gagan sir, I would like to ask you, Do you think now that we have decriminalization of these offenses, this move will lower the confidence of our creditors, which will offset the gain that we have, if any, by bringing the investors?
Again, at the sake of repetition, as a creditor, I am interested in my money. If the government can ensure that my money is safe, I am not bothered whether you put the other person behind the bar or not. So if you can give me an alternate solution, maybe in terms of efficient civil justice delivery system, where my money is safe, then then only I can invest or I can give something on credit to the buyer or to the purchaser. Otherwise, the entire economic or business cycle will come to an halt. So yes, definitely it's going to ease out things for the investors, but at the same time, we have to keep in mind that we have efficient justice delivery system, as Mr. Rao was talking about, that even written statements takes years to be filed. And how can I expect my money to be back? Although the government is putting things in on track by virtue of Commercial Courts Act, by virtue of improve changes in the CPC, by virtue of having arbitration being closed in 1.5 years. But is are is that I'm do I see that happening on the ground or not? That is the question actually I'm left with. If the answer is no, definitely I would not like to invest my money.
And Tavishi, just one clarification. I think this is important for us to just flag. It's not that these provisions have been decriminalized. There is a proposal to decriminalize them. The government has essentially said, we intend to do this. Please tell us what you think, right? And it's interesting because there are pulls and pushes everywhere. So there is industry which is saying, please decriminalize ease of doing business. There is industry saying, don't decriminalize. How will we get our money? Exactly the point that you are making. So I think that balance ultimately has to be achieved. The way I see it, I think the point that Gagan was making, the government has to identify provisions which in fact deter, which are really unnecessary from a criminalization point of view. And it's these ministerial acts of, have I filed my return in time? Have I responded to your notice in time? The FEMA has an interesting situation where FEMA is technically decriminalized, right? So, I mean, FEMA has moved away from FERA. FERA was a penal statute. FEMA is essentially a civil adjudicatory statute. But you know that there are instances where under the FEMA, under the guise of the fact that the adjudicating authority has the powers of a civil court, people have actually been arrested because they failed to respond to a notice. Now, that's not the object of the legislation. It's not the object of the law. But unfortunately, there is this little window and there is some litigation to that effect. So that crystallization has to be very clear. The government has to make it, and Parliament in particular, and legislation has to stipulate that these things can be dealt with either by a rap of the knuckles or during your periodic licensing process, etc., etc. It can be dealt with and weeded out. If you don't file your returns, I will not renew your license for next year. Right. So that's the thing. I think that exercise of evaluating existing laws, so it's happening at two levels. One is the point that Gagan made, albeit in passing, that there is a consistent effort at weeding out archaic laws which have no place in society, because ultimately law is answering to societal change and societal needs. But the more important thing is to also evaluate existing statutes and to see whether some provisions are relevant in today's context. They may have been useful at a particular point in time, but are they relevant today? And things like compliances. If everything is electronic, why should you not be able to, as a regulator, monitor? You don't need somebody to come to you with a piece of paper. Why do you need provisions like that? So that's the thing. The rest, of course, as mentioned already, if you are able to demonstrate that a person who has a dispute, whether civil or criminal, has access to an independent judiciary, which fortunately we do substantially, right? Which is independent, but more importantly is also equipped to deal with these issues swiftly. Now that's something, like I said, I mean, and unfortunately in Delhi we are spoiled. I mean, we are perhaps the only high court in the country, or perhaps the only trial courts in the country where you can file something in the morning and perhaps get a hearing in the afternoon. Delhi High Court, we've had instances of mentionings being done at 2 p.m. and listings being done at 4:30 and, orders being passed at 5:30. So we are far ahead of the pack in that sense. But that's the model to emulate at the trial court level all over the country. The minute you get that system in place, half your issues then get sorted, because if the trial court judgment is clean, clear, and well reasoned, then the appeal process becomes that much more difficult. Once the first appeal is gone, the second appeal is anyway even narrower. So that also reduces litigation. And in the process, when you have a body of jurisprudence which sheds clarity on a whole bunch of things, that makes it easier for then, future cases to be dealt with. That's the whole point of having a system which is based on precedent. But unfortunately, there, of course, we have, you can take the same case to 3 different benches and you get 3 different responses, all of them dealing with the same set of information and the same precedents. That's where the problem is. But those are human problems. I don't think there's a problem with the system in that sense.
The key point being here is that communication should be done effectively as of now to clarify things.
Yeah, and pick your battles, right? I mean, so you've picked up 5 statutes. At least show us that when you've picked up these 5, why have you picked up the 5? And please tell us how you intend to actually translate this into ease of doing business. Just by telling me that you're going to delete 103 of the Insurance Act means nothing. Either you tell me that, listen, I have not had a single instance where somebody has set up an insurance company without registration. So it's frankly, I mean, I don't need it. Tomorrow I can deal with him under some other statute. Or the other way to do it is to say, I've had this has been on the books, but there are 3 other provisions in the same statute which can address this issue. So yes, this is redundant. So this is just a case of, overcautious lawmaking or legislation, and it's adding more paper to the process. The other way to do it, as Gagan was mentioning, this conduct is already prescribed under 3 other statutes. Adding a 4th statute is really doing nothing new. And on the contrary, what it's doing is when I come to prosecuting, I have to add 1 more statute, another charge. I have to prove that. I have to spend some time on that. So that only delays the justice system a little more. So that's it, I think.
So, yeah, with respect to, yes.
I would like to differ on one aspect, which is that there has to be consistency shown between the judiciary and the legislature. Because if I go back in, let's say, 1 year, 2 years down the line, we had 138, which was, we had a landmark judgment of meter instruments, which talked about the adjudication within 6 months time period. And then we had fast track courts process being shown to us for 138 cases. And now we see a complete U-turn. So I do not know what is the intent that behind this legislation, if it is enacted at all, that once we are having a hope that okay, we are making the existing laws more powerful. And here we see 8th June notification, which I see as a complete U-turn by the government. So I find some inconsistency in the conduct or in the body language or in the communication by the legislature with respect to this particular notification.
Okay, sir. So again, with respect to this particular notification, do you think this will embolden the defaulters? Will it embolden the defaulters to take advantage of this notification? There is a delay of adjudication. Will the defaulters be at a greater advantage in the system now?
Yeah, Tavishi, if I have to answer that, if you look at an average life time of a particular case of 138, it takes 4 to 5 years for the adjudication, and that means your money is actually stuck for 4 to 5 years. And if my intention is to actually default on the money, I can easily take advantage of this fact that now even it is decriminalized. So the civil side, until as I said, until the civil side is actually equipped, or we have transformation being done on the civil side of the jurisprudence, then definitely defaulters will take it for a ride.
No, I think I agree with Gagan. I believe it's okay. So 2018, you have 2 major amendments which seem to kind of add teeth to the NI Act, and suddenly you have this, like he says, it's a complete volte-face as it were. The real issue is, of course, it's if the government, and that's why I said, it's also a system. It's also an issue of communication, rather than making these very high-sounding, using high-sounding phrases like ease of doing business. If the government effectively just put down on paper, or at least spoke to industry and said, these are the changes I've done on your civil adjudicatory front, I guarantee you that, like I have ensured that an arbitration will not go beyond 18 months. A civil suit will get decided, especially a commercial suit will get decided within a year's time. Now, if the government can make that guarantee, then frankly, as he says, I have no desire to send somebody behind bars. It makes no difference to my life. As a businessman, I want hard cash. I want liquidity, and that's really what matters as far as we are concerned. So I think, like I said, it's not that the government obviously doesn't have a plan. It has a plan. It's not articulating it well enough. But I think that part of it is because of their experience. And again, unfortunately, that experience, according to me, is limited largely to Delhi and a few other metros, that the civil processes are now, in fact, moving on track. But otherwise, really speaking, you can keep, classifying what was a ordinary civil court as a commercial court for the purpose of the Commercial Courts Act. But nothing has changed on the ground. I mean, they still take as much time or whatever. So you still get an adjournment when you ask for. But did I need the Commercial Courts Act? Order 17, if I'm not wrong, or of the CPC said a court should not normally grant more than 3 adjournments. The CPC has been there forever. How many adjournments does one get in an ordinary commercial case? So I think it's a mixed bag. As lawyers, we have to be more responsible. We have to ensure that we don't, when we are defendants, we don't dodge, and we have to assist the court in coming to a quick decision. And it's not always to play the role that your client has said कि अच्छा इसको जितना खींच सकते हो आप, please drag this as much as possible, and if it's dragged on long enough, I'll probably get a settlement or whatever. So
Yes, sir. So I had this question. Don't you agree that until the courts are made more efficient, the purpose of decriminalization will hurt the banking system the most, which is already finding it difficult to deal with the NPAs?
see that again, so this is something that I feel particularly strongly about, because it's very easy to say make our courts efficient. I think our judges are the most burdened perhaps in the world over, if you look at judge to work, judge to population ratio. What about lawyers? Don't we have a responsibility? And that's the point I was making just now. How many times have we walked into a courtroom and taken an adjournment for whatever reason? How many times has has a particular bar association gone on strike because it was somebody's birthday? How many times have people said that we will not work in the afternoon because it's a particular festival? Should the law account for all of this? So I think the paperwork is there, the laws are there. It's a question of implementation. There's also this, unfortunately, everybody feels the need to be, and this was the example I was giving to Gagan and you yesterday when we were talking. None of us have walked into a courtroom where we know that the judge will refuse an adjournment, hoping that we'll get an adjournment. We've all gone in prepared fully. But if we know that a judge is the kind who, if you, ask for an adjournment and you'll get one, you will take it. So then there are, of course, times when, a colleague at the other side wants accommodation. And, you accommodate because you know that you may also be in the same position. But those are aspects that one has to work out professionally. So you accommodate where there is a genuine issue. You don't accommodate when, you believe it's a dodge tactic because you're answerable to a court. So I think just to come back to your question, do courts need to be more efficient? Of course, the answer is yes. But please remember, it's that same thing about information overload. There is a huge increase in volume. It's impossible for somebody to be ahead of the pack. But yes, I think given the circumstances, they're doing a creditable job of it. But really speaking, the place where you really need to target is the hinterland in the states. That's where pendencies are much higher. That's where access to justice is a much bigger challenge. And once you start fixing that, is that same issue that bothers us today. Why is there migration from villages to cities? If you created enough incentive to people to stay home back in their villages and you gave them employment, they wouldn't feel the need to come here and put pressure on cities. So it's that whole thing. I mean, nobody wants to do something because of the fact that, nobody wants to be inefficient just for the sake of being it. There is obviously an advantage in being inefficient as far as this is concerned. So this, like I said, all of this, at least in the last 3-4 years, 15 onwards, you see several attempts by the government to make the system more efficient. Yes, it doesn't have a magic wand. It'll take a decade or so. But my kids keep making fun of me because I keep saying, we are about 50 years behind the West and don't compare yourselves. But at the rate at which we are going, we are obviously ahead of them on a few things, and we'll probably get faster ahead of them on a few more and catch up, and if not, go far, far ahead eventually. It's only a question of time.
Just to add on, this actually puts us back to the question of pendency. And there are various attempts to address this question of pendency by either bringing in more efficient legislations or by making changes in the principal legislations, or by exercising the option of costs which were never exercised before, or by putting a stop on the adjournments, as Mr. Rao was telling. But if you look at the statistics, majority of the litigation is actually done by the state. So with due respect to the government of the day, one fails to understand that the government is the major litigant if you look at the number of cases, and the same money of the exchequer is being utilized to contest the state. So I fail to understand then why actually, how when the onus is on the state, how the state is going to actually reduce the pendency. We keep talking about the reduction in pendency, and whereas we ourselves, because we enjoy the battery and army of lawyers, so the state thinks that okay, we can fight an individual, but then where are the checks and balances so that the state actually is not the major litigant if you look at the statistics.
But just on that, I don't know, and Gagan, perhaps you probably have looked at this a little more closely. See, the government is a major litigant at the appellate level and in certain areas. But your basic commercial disputes, barring, say, arbitrations and things like that right now, is government the biggest litigant? So your basic money recovery suits, etc., are private disputes.
Right.
So you're right. I mean, as far as government is concerned, the problem is, of course, the internal process of nobody wants to pen. So if you were to sign a document or give a legal opinion which says you shall not appeal this despite being an arm of state, questions, alarm bells go ringing and nobody is willing to take accountability. So the standard response is, sir, aap appeal file kar dijiye, we will see, court kahegi to hum kar lenge.
Actually,
and we forget that each of these arms are technically supposed to be complementary arms, right? So each of you should have the ability, and that's why the Constitution effectively said that it was open to Parliament to confer the prerogative of issuing writs to any court. Now, what was the underlying philosophy? So is it that there is nothing special about, say, the High Court or the Supreme Court? Of course they are. In the hierarchy, they're up there. But in the justice delivery system, isn't the object of each of these three entities, the High Court, the Supreme Court, and the lower courts, the same? They're all meant to do justice. So
right.
It's that approach, I think, that one needs to look at. So if a Babu on the ground can sign off and say, I don't see any merit in contesting this, the guy has a genuine claim, and he should be able to keep that without the fear of vigilance standing up over his head day after tomorrow, 2 days before his retirement to hold his pension. That should be fine.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I was hinting at that only. You hit the nail on the head. So.
The question is whether the government has hit the nail on the head in this notification. Let's come back to that.
Yeah, we got digressed actually.
Yes, Tavishi, sorry.
Yes, sir. So, don't you think it is the right, like we have advocated a lot on this particular aspect. So, don't you think that it is actually the right move by the government, where criminal rules are so pervasive that no one is safe from arrest or prosecution? And then there is another problem where the entire process itself, whereas it has a lot of safeguards, is worse than a punishment. So the process stretches and there are a number of things happening. So don't you think this may just be a right move by the government and they have actually hit the nail on the head?
See, I agree. Okay, I believe that the underlying object is correct, and nobody can argue, with that. Criminalizing most conduct really doesn't serve any purpose, except perhaps it increases corruption and it harasses people, and it is misused more often than not. My problem is, of course, with when you are criminalizing it, or in your attempt to decriminalize, have you missed the wood for the trees? Speaking for myself, I would have ideally wanted the government to take a look at the Prevention of Money Laundering Act and the schedule once again. And to say, do I really need to have the offense of cheating in the schedule? The statute was intended to answer to an international need and was intended to deal with money laundering arising out of drug trafficking, arms dealing, etc., etc. Now that has effectively become a statute where if I cheat somebody on a basic commercial property transaction, he can file an FIR against me because that's an IPC offense. And basis that FIR, the Enforcement Directorate will step in. And the Enforcement Directorate will then go and do two parallel activities. So one, you will have an FIR. That gentleman may file a civil suit against you for recovery of the money that he believes, has been obtained by you on the basis of a contract which is vitiated by either fraud or misrepresentation, etc., etc. The ED will then step in, The ED will run a process of adjudication to attach the proceeds of crime, as it were, and parallelly you will be prosecuted under Section 3. Now, for what joy? And is that what the Enforcement Directorate was meant to do? So that again, like I said, so you criminalize conduct on the left side, you decriminalize some trivial offenses on the right side. Alongside, you also decriminalize some very, very serious offenses. An auditor willfully making a false statement, the government believes, is something that needs to be decriminalized. I'm wondering why. What have we learned from Satyam then? So that's the balance. I mean, like, please do decriminalize all sections which say, if I don't produce documents before you, I will face imprisonment or prosecution. Please take it away. Impose a simple monetary penalty and leave it at that. And if he doesn't pay the penalty, ensure that his license or he's no longer able to do business. Put an end to it. It's the same principle on, you have, say, akin to driving licenses in the West. So you get points. You default once, you lose a few points. You default twice, you lose a few more points. If you reach a threshold of points, which essentially says you will no longer be able to drive a car, the guy will become extremely circumspect and never break the law. Number two, if you make it impossible for him to get insurance with a high risk rate, that takes care of his point. Then, so therefore, deterrent is, you can involve deterrence in many ways. And this takes me back to the point you were making. Could you have just removed the 10-year imprisonment and said, okay, fine, a penalty of 25 crores? Should that be enough? Or should it be 25 crores or any other monies that you have raised? Now, the problem with that any other monies that you have raised is, okay, fine, I've gone and cheated 50 people. I've collected 100 crores in premium, right? I've paid 25 crores in penalty. What happens to the balance 75? Now, do those people have to go and file cases against me? Or should the government not take all the 100 and then distribute it? If you look at it practically on the ground, there are problems. I mean, there are administrative problems, but there are ways to get around that. But do I really need to put a guy behind bars? But yes, why should a guy who doesn't have a license, who's collected money on false pretext, who effectively has committed an offense under the IPC, not face prosecution? But there the government could simply have told us, it's an IPC offense. I don't need to create a separate offense. It's already. So when I say decriminalizing, I'm actually not decriminalizing. I'm just making it clear that you are not going to be prosecuted under Statute A because you are anyway liable to be prosecuted under Statute B.
This actually, Mr. Rao brought about a very good point that if we can have some index like in the Germany, we have everything linked to the insurance premium. So once you commit any offense, your premium actually rises. So that's a very big deterrent for anybody to commit any offense in Germany. So, but here in India, we are decriminalizing actually the credit rating agencies, which themselves are responsible for attracting investments. So how can we expect index or something of that sort once the government chooses to decriminalize the credit rating agencies, which is the basis for the disbursement of loan or for disbursement of money for any economic activity in the country?
In fact,
alternative here, which we can have instead of just decriminalizing it and having a backup for this.
Yeah, I think the point that he's making is you can approach the same problem at multiple weapons, and criminalization need not necessarily be the one. And just the point on the credit investment companies, aspect, the section that they seek to decriminalize, it's very interesting because ultimately, there's this favorite line that I have from one of my favorite movies called "Duniya Hai Gol and Har Paap Ka Double Roll." So, credit rating is the basis on which other agencies determine A, whether to deal with you or not financially, and B, on what terms. So if I have fraudulently given you a AAA rating, basis which somebody decides to lend you money in the first instance, and B lends you money at a far, lesser rate of interest than one would otherwise, and that person defaults, you're actually setting in motion a vicious cycle of events. So bankers lend you money because of a credit rating agency's certification. That certification is bound to be willfully false. You say that action, the first action, which is essentially the foundation, is decriminalized. So I can now just basically give you any certificate without any fear and hope that tomorrow you may be able to find an IPC offense which you can fit me under if at all you have to. What's the purpose and what's the message? Because again, I keep going back to the statement made by the government. The government says, willful, apart from willful fraudulent conduct, other things are problematic. So, I mean, sorry, willful and fraudulent conduct is problematic. Other things which are not willful and fraudulent really don't need to be criminalized. But the statute that you are seeking to decriminalize says who has willfully made a false statement. So is there really a connect there? What is the nexus with the object sought to be achieved if I were to apply an Article 14 yards?
Okay, so my last question to you is, already you have already touched upon this point, but just for a more precise of yours, what do you think is the solution to address the pendency of cases and make recovery more efficient, especially in the light of this decriminalization or the sorting out of offenses? So what is your view of the recovery?
Okay, can I tell you, Tavishi, at least my experience as a lawyer, I have seen cases where matters have been decided in less than 6 months using just the tools of the trade, nothing else. I mean, there is no jugaad, there is no, backhanded, underhanded dealing. It is just applying the Code of Civil Procedure and the law of the land. It is as simple as filing a suit for recovery, demonstrating that the individual is seeking to remove his belongings and therefore filing an application under Order 38 Rule 5, getting an injunction in the first place, getting something attached, or moving application for discovery and interrogatories and being able to then move an application under Order 12.6 and getting a judgment on admission. Now, easier said than done. So I've seen cases, and I can only say that with the confidence that I am saying it with, because I have actually seen this happen in cases where I have appeared in, where we've had start to finish in less than 6 months, start to finish property recovery suits in a year's time. But we've also seen the other extreme. I have personally appeared in a suit which was instituted in 1982, a suit for specific performance, which got decided last year, after it was transferred from the Delhi High Court to Saket. And I can tell you, if it was in the Delhi High Court, it would not get decided for the next 3 years. I mean, sorry, for the next 10 years, perhaps. So that's, again, that balance between, what the court can do and what the court has done so far. So, but that's why this whole move of, enhancing jurisdiction, putting a little more responsibility down the line. So trial courts obviously have the ability to deal with issues which are slightly more higher in value, etc., etc. So this is also a realization in societal terms that what was deemed to be a huge amount of money, say 20 years ago, 20 lakh was the Delhi High Court's jurisdiction. Today, 20 lakhs in real terms doesn't mean much in the overall scheme of things, especially when you look at, the Prime Minister talking of us being a $5 trillion economy. So why should the High Court bother itself with amounts of 2 crores? Perhaps is there a need to increase that jurisdiction and take it from 2 to 5 to 10 and give the trial courts a little more responsibility? They're equipped. We have really, really good judges now who are, and increasingly, so legal education is changing. So the quality of lawyers is getting better. Not to say, of course, that it was bad previously, but I think we are all being trained to respond to the needs of time. So this whole thing of, being more tech savvy, we're going into paperless frameworks, etc., etc. This whole business of being able to argue from your house. So all of that, I think these are all steps that are being taken in conjunction with each other. And frankly, I believe that in the next decade or so, you will see some phenomenal changes. The only thing that can prevent any of this from functioning is the people that man systems, on both sides, whether it is on the side of the judiciary or as far as lawyers are concerned. No client, a client really doesn't care. Beyond a point, you may do a brilliant job inside a courtroom. But if at the end of the day you lose, he'll say, "Vakil sahab, aapne bahas to acha kiya, magar ultimately mujhe kya mila?" Right? So if you have the ability, and that's why mediation has become so successful. Why? Because everybody realizes that fine, if you get stuck in this cog, then everybody ends up losing. So chalo, theek hai, we'll find a via media, I'll get something, you'll get something, we'll walk. But isn't that the whole point of commercial approaches to life and law and business? So as long as I get, it's that bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. So if I get 500 rupees from you today, despite the fact that you owe me 700 rupees, rather than, trying to get 650 rupees 10 years down the line, I'd rather get my 500 and close matters and move on. Yes, I may be more circumspect in dealing with you tomorrow. And that's the whole point. Now, is this whole business of decriminalizing checks? You said, is it our debtors going to become bolder? But are you telling me that people who then transact with you will not insist on advance payments? So it may change, behavior on the ground will change depending upon who's in a position to command. And I feel it's that just, taking an example closer home. As young lawyers, you end up doing a lot of work where you are virtually never paid, or you're paid, what the client believes you're worth. As you see, the senior the lawyer becomes, more often than not, a senior lawyer can say, listen, unless I see my fees, I'm not going to turn up. So that's it. So that's the ground reality. I mean, and a lot of business should be left to be done on the ground. I mean, people, reputations matter. If you have good credibility, people will work with you. So whether it is check, credit, etc., etc. But that's why my problem with that whole, decriminalizing that credit rating agency thing. Are you really taking away who will guard the guardians in that sense? And that's the problem. So I believe that steps in the right direction. I wish they would articulate it slightly better. If they told you that don't worry, and told industry that, listen, you have nothing to fear. You believe that this guy is going to default. He's not going to default because we've cleaned up this side of the system for you. In fact, you don't have to deal with cops. Nobody likes dealing with cops. There is always this, fear looming large over our heads. Walk into a courtroom, file a petition, and you'll probably get a decree in 8 to 10 months. And if you can actually demonstrate that, you've achieved what you had to achieve. And with the kind of pressures that our country faces on the whole, I mean, that's a miracle. And what effectively, when somebody says, do you think they'll do it? Will they be able to achieve a miracle? I believe, yes, why not? The question is when. And we are still, but I mean, the fact that we are still surviving despite so many pulls and pressures itself is a miracle. So I think India is used to miracles. It will happen. I don't think we need to be pessimistic about it. These are experiments. You never know. Day after tomorrow, they may say, okay, fine, we won't do it now. And maybe listening to, a whole bunch of things like we've said, they'll say, okay, fine, all these basic sections we will decriminalize. No point penalizing you for failing to file your income tax return on time. But suppose they say, if you don't file your income tax return on time, you will pay X% more tax. How many people will not file their returns on time? So there are creative ways of dealing with it. I think it's just that you need that political will to do so. And fortunately, this government is a majority. They have no excuse not to be able to shove it. I wish they'd only focus. I mean, and ideally, of course, they should focus on all the things that really matter.
So, sir, these are my questions. I would like to invite our participants to ask the questions in the chat box. I'll be asking them to the panelists. So, sir, we already have a question from Sanskar Jain. He asks, don't you think that this legislation is going to affect small businesses who are dependent on criminal liability to recover their money from someone who defaulted on payment through a check?
I don't. Okay, so at least, okay, there are two ways of looking at it. One is, of course, the practical element, and the other is the legal element. Was 138 intended to be a recovery process? The answer is no. Right? 138 was only intended to ensure a certain level of circumspection when somebody wrote out a check. And the object that it sought to achieve was that when people issued checks, they would be reasonably sure that they had the ability to kind of make good the money that was underlying. Which is why you have 139, there's a presumption that the check was issued against some liability. And the fact that you had to go through a criminal process was a further deterrent. Having said that, if you're talking about MSMEs, there is a huge amount of work that government has put in on the MSME framework, because at the end of the day, they've realized that, really speaking, it is these that form the backbone or the core of any big industry or any big economy. So while yes, decriminalizing a check bouncing process may seem like it is no longer a deterrent. It doesn't mean that you can't deal with the gentleman. It doesn't mean that you don't have access to the MSME council. There is an arbitration process prescribed there. There is enhanced, interest regimes that are applicable. IBC, from an IBC framework, it's only an MSME promoter who can actually take back his company. Others, are defaulters and are not insulated. So I think there are various remedies that the government is putting together. This is for everything that it takes away. That they say that for every window that closes or every door that closes, a window opens. I'm sure they'll find that balance. I don't necessarily agree, and I'm with you on that. That I don't believe that decriminalizing 138 only because, and I think the only reason they're decriminalizing 138, at least the way I see it, is because they feel that there is just too much of a backlog in courts. That is something that can be dealt with. Like the Supreme Court has issued directions, all of that. The government just needs to get its act together. I don't believe that decriminalizing is the answer. But even if they do decriminalize, I don't see it being too much having a very negative impact as long as they strengthen the civil administration in that sense. So that's fine. I think in the overall scheme of things, it's a call that somebody has to take. They've taken a call. Whether ultimately they will roll it back or not is something that time will tell.
So there is another question. So this is a very journalistic question. What exactly would you mean by economic offenses, and how do you bifurcate offenses as economic or criminal or civil, and how do you draw a separate line?
Okay, interesting question, because I mean, I've always wondered, what the logic is. The way I see it is, even in economic offenses have a criminal component, they also have a civil component, right? So the only thing is, because the government looks at some of these acts or actions, as it were, as having an impact on the financial element of society. So therefore, they are seen as economic offenses. So 138, for instance, the whole reason 138 is because at the end of the day, you need clear commercial transactions and to enable a business to prosper. It's the same thing with having liquidity. So the ability to issue a check, and please remember, you didn't have 138 in the statute books forever. You're dealing with a statute of 1881, if I'm not wrong. And you have 138 being introduced by the 1988 amendment. So it comes into force sometime in early 1989 or late 88. Now, at that time, it was in answer to the need on the ground that we had so many people who were issuing checks and were not honoring them. Now, you have two ways of dealing with it as a businessman. One is, of course, to say, I will no longer work on credit. I will ask for an advance. I will either get myself secured by way of a bank guarantee or an LC or whatever and deal with you. Otherwise, yes, if you're asking me for credit, then I'll charge you 3 rupees more. So I have to cover myself in some way. And that's that whole concept of time value of money, which the IBC also in sense recognizes, and which the Supreme Court in fact clarifies further in its recent decision. So I think the bottom line is essentially that a civil transaction is really a civil transaction, but does not a basic civil contract where Mr. A agrees to buy goods from Mr. B. And these are examples you see in the Contract Act, and defaults. That also has an economic element. The difference, I guess, is this, where it is a failure to honor a commitment because of reasons that are in the ordinary course of business. There is no malintent, there is no mens rea, that is civil. From an economic perspective, where I deal with you at a dishonest foundation, then obviously there is an intent to destroy you economically. So, and it's the same principle of somebody who says, now that 103 of the Insurance Act is gone, let me set up an insurance company. I don't have to worry about 25 crores or 10 years in prison. Let me send out, a flyer in the newspaper tomorrow morning to the neighborhood saying, I will insure your house. Till yesterday, you were getting 1 crore ka insurance at, say 7,000 rupees. I will secure you for 1,000 rupees. And 50,000 people actually give me $1,000. Now that's clearly an economic problem. But the way to look at it is also another way, which is, assume that we are a $1 trillion economy today. Does the fact that somebody has cheated somebody of 5 lakhs, 10 lakhs, 15 lakhs, is that really an economic problem? Or do we have to look at numbers a little more realistically? Would the government have said anything in excess of X will be dealt with by a special statute? But if you are engaging in small amounts of 5 lakhs, 10 lakhs, 50 lakhs, and you have dealt with 50 people, effectively, what have you done? People have been cheated to the tune of, say, anything from 5,000 rupees to 1 lakh per head. Now, it may seem a lot from the individual's perspective, but from the economy's perspective, 50 lakhs is nothing. That has nothing to do with, and that's the approach that I think perhaps lawmakers are looking at and eventually will consider, that it's only things that really matter to the nation as a whole, those should be criminal from an economic perspective, rather than things that could be resolved over a regular justice system process.
Right. That is why perhaps we have threshold limit in case of EOW and money laundering, actually.
Sorry.
I was just saying that that is perhaps the reason why we have threshold limit in case of economic of EOW has threshold limit of 2 crores, and then PMLA has a threshold limit of 5 crores. So that is to address the sanctity or the seriousness of the offense, because I think the government of the day realizes that okay, we can only focus on certain few battles. We can't
Right.
be going after everybody, given the limited investigating machinery that is at their disposal.
Yeah. There's another interesting point. This is Shatabdi, who says that the contention by credit rating agencies that their ratings are merely advisory and their personal opinion, which is why they've escaped criminal liability. See, I completely agree. But the point is where you willfully make a false statement. And see, you're supposedly an expert in your field. I mean, it is it's like coming to a lawyer and getting an opinion which the lawyer then says, I'm not responsible for. The whole point of, and of course, we are all taught, you pad your opinion in a manner where you say, it is likely, it is possible, never commit yourself on the front foot. So most opinions you see, even by lawyers, are hedged in with several ifs and buts. The question is, should a lawyer be asked, what is your opinion? Is this what the law is? I mean, it's one thing to say, like Tavishi's question, do you think that I will get prosecuted? There may be 50 answers to that. You may be prosecuted if the evidence is against you. But if I come to you and say I've committed an offense and I've killed somebody, will I be punished? The answer has to be yes. Now, the question is, what is the process is a separate issue. So I think, do they need to be given a more responsible role? See, that's again a policy issue. But the question is, at the end of the day, can you escape responsibility once you are asked to opine on creditworthiness? Can you turn around and say, listen, this was only a recommendation? Surely you have an obligation to at least, make that recommendation true to what you believe and based on facts that are available before you.
Okay, sir. So we've made a poll for the participants. So can we launch the poll, please? So there's a very 50-50 distributed point of view with respect to these questions.
And understandably, I think that should tell you that it's an open debate, right? Exactly that. But do you have the ability to tell us whether, for instance, that last question on whether the courts are equipped to handle it? What is the general sense there?
Yes, sir. So they do believe that the courts are not equipped to handle explosion in the number of cases.
Yeah. Because see, it will take away from the criminal system and it will translate into civil suits. A lot of people don't file civil suits for recovery and instead use 138s. And usually you'll see it's not 138 alone, it's 138 read with 420, to make it non-bailable, etc., etc. So that pressure will be put here. And I think there's a very interesting article for people who are interested. Mr. Bharat Chugh, who's somebody who I've never really interacted with, but who I keep reading of and who I admire a lot, especially from what I've seen from his writings and otherwise from what I've heard. He's written a very interesting piece, and he starts using on decriminalization, especially on the 138 thing. and whether that debtors will have a free for a free for all in that sense. And he says the Kafkaesque nature of our civil courts, and it's pretty much that. But like I said, I mean, Delhi High Court and at least some of our district courts are far, far ahead of the pack. That's the benchmark, and I think you have to strive to kind of improve that benchmark further. And it shouldn't matter whether it's a big case or a small case. And that's the unfortunate ground reality that in international commercial arbitration gets precedence, will get heard by, because there are, senior lawyers, etc. over, say, 3 days or 5 days on an expedited basis. But in ordinary civil suit where two people, two regular people who've had a commercial transaction don't get the time of day. So that is something that, that whole principle of equal justice to all needs to be implemented with a little more, I think, sensitivity. That's about it.
So Gagan sir and Rao sir, you're both hosts. You can view the poll results right now. Can you let me know if you can see them?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Sorry, where do you see that?
It's next to the participants.
Okay. Okay, sorry, I can't see it, but I'll figure it out with you later. Yeah? Why should we keep people hanging on this? Did I see somebody? I think somebody wants a question or whatever. Muhammad Majid has got his hand up. I don't know. I mean, maybe we could end after that.
Mohammed, can you pitch your question in the chat box if you have any question? So we also have an extreme towards the question, do you think all economic offenses mentioned in the list should be decriminalized? So 91% it's a no.
So. I mean, I think we've answered Mohit's question. Shilpul, I don't know what Shilpul's question is, but Shipul, sorry. See, I firmly believe, at least just on Mohit's question, I think this whole, this whole business of the criminal justice system being more deterrent somewhere is a misnomer. You can actually create as much havoc with a simple civil suit, rightly put, and with the right interim order and the right questions in discovery at an early stage, then you would probably be able to put in through a criminal process. The way I see it, and one of the reasons is also because I think the way the criminal justice system works on the ground, to a large extent, there is some harassment of the complainant also. There is the element of having to deal with cops, etc., etc. The civil justice system, at least, is a lot cleaner there from that perspective. And if you're fortunate to kind of, land up before a court which is slightly proactive, and you have the ability to kind of play your cards right on the law, why not? I think it's as potent a weapon. That's the beauty of the law, right? I mean, and which is why you can face criminal prosecution for the same act and also face, a civil suit in relation to the same. So that's what. So they're both remedies. They're both aspects which give you the same result, albeit in slightly different, with different approaches.
Sir, but what we see on ground is that there is a propensity to convert every civil offense into a criminal offense because of two reasons. One, because of vindictive element into the criminal justice system, and second element is the time factor. And if we can take care of the vindictive element, is actually driven by more by the behavioral aspect of the person, but the second element is actually driven by the time aspect of the adjudication. And if we can address a time issue, which I hope will be taken care of over the time span, and as we can see the work being done by the government, so I think we may automatically see reduction in the criminal complaints.
So that's one. But Gagan and Tavishi, just the last point. I think since we are, a whole bunch of us are lawyers, all law students in that sense. And of course, as lawyers, we are always law students. If you shift your client's expectation from "mujhe decree chahiye" to "I will get you a place where commercially you are happy," right? It's just a question of managing expectations from that perspective. Like I said, somebody has a claim for, say, he believes that he's owed 1 crore from Mr. X. Mr. X files a response saying, "No, I don't owe you anything." And in reality, you know that the gentleman perhaps is owed, say, about 80 lakhs.
Right.
If you are able to give him the ability by virtue of various proceedings to arrive at a place where the other side makes an offer saying, "आज मैं आपको 60 लाख लेता हूं, आप ले लो और खत्म करो इसको." 60 lakhs today in, say, 6 months of litigation or 8 months of litigation, as opposed to chasing that 1 crore, through the next 2 years, by the time trial finishes, then the possibility of an appeal where, of course, there may be a deposit, but then you may only be able to withdraw against a bank guarantee or some security. Or chalo, theek hai, you get execution, but there is always this looming threat that the appeal court may overturn and therefore you may have to return the money back. So these issues are, so that's I think it needs a change in mindset. And that's why I'm saying, if you, for a minute, stop being a lawyer and think of it as a businessman who then has to argue his own case, a lot of these things will get, a lot clearer. Then you look at it not only from the perspective of the law, you look at it from the perspective of achieving results. And if you can achieve results using the mechanism that the law provides within a shorter time frame, there is no greater high as a lawyer. And I can tell you that with personal experience. So the challenge is you have to keep pushing yourself as a lawyer saying, "Acha, main is case ko kitni jaldi khatam kar sakta hu aur kanuni taur pe khatam kar sakta hu." So that's the thing.
Right.
There's a question in the chat box. It's not specific to economic offenses.
Right.
There's a mention of repetitive and redundant laws.
Yeah.
So the question is, you mentioned that some laws are repetitive or redundant and could do with being repealed. What about the laws that are there but the courts don't follow them?
Right.
Are there such examples in commercial cases too, like in respect of rape cases?
Okay. You have something called the Usurious Loans Act. It's a statute that was enacted in the early 1900s, if I'm not wrong, which was aimed at dealing with money lenders who, lent money at significantly higher rates of interest. And the end result was the person who borrowed money would effectively be left with nothing. Right. Today, you seem to have a slightly more refined system. But you still have, for instance, if you default on your credit card, you may have to pay about 36 to 39% interest. Now, is that good? Is that bad? Now, when somebody says the Usurious Loans Act should not apply or should apply, the courts look at you and say, "Listen, this is a commercial transaction. You've agreed to, take on a Citibank credit card and you've agreed to the terms." Now, that's a balance. But really speaking, from a commercial perspective, I think the way I see it, there are more provisions in the law which are not used. And I'm just giving you examples from the CPC, for instance. Again, this whole business of time frames. Do I really need a time frame for a law to be decided in? The CPC seems to suggest step-by-step approaches, right? So it says you file a suit. These are the requirements. Once you meet these, a suit is registered, a plaint is registered as a suit, and summons is issued. The written statement has to be filed within technically 30 days. And then there is a 90-day window that you get in addition. So it's 120 days today. The earlier regime was 30 plus 90. Then you had the CPC, which said that you have the ability to get 30 days over anything else that, the Act provides. Some of these could be clarified. The fact that the CPC says, ordinarily, you should not get more than 3 adjournments. But when somebody says, "Listen, my counsel is not available," and why? Because my counsel has been briefed in 3 other matters. Increasingly, there was a time when, you would get an adjournment. But today, we are all called upon. I mean, we don't get passovers in court. So there is enough scope within the existing legal framework to deal with situations. Yes, there are statutes which, in a sense, have no place in today's day and age. They have to be reworked. There are also statutes, for instance, it's that same principle of, say, 498A. 498A was brought in to meet a societal need. But it's not that before 498A, a person had no remedies. A person had remedies in law. The only difference was, yes, if your in-laws beat you up, you had to go under the regular ICC provision for hurt. or attempt to murder or whatever. So today you have an additional provision which is only reflective of legislative intent, saying, this whole business of harassing a woman is bad, and the law recognizes this as a separate offense in addition to whatever is there. So that's what. So I think that's the way I see it. So even from a set of commercial laws, there may be laws which are slightly redundant. The fact that you've had to revamp the Companies Act in 2013 is one instance. You've had the Contract Act from 1872, but you've needed to tweak it to meet the vagaries of, say, information technology. That's another aspect. But if you were to say, I don't need to tweak if you didn't have the Information Technology Act, would a transaction made over email still not be capable of being brought within the confines of offer and acceptance? The answer is yes.
Yes, sir. This was our Q&A session. Paul gave us a great insight into what the participants have in mind. So with this, we come to the end of our session. I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to Raj Shekhar sir and Gagan sir for sparing time out of their busy schedule, especially on a Sunday for today's event, and it was very informative. I would also like to thank Bar and Bench and Pallavi ma'am for supporting today's webinar. I would also thank Gusu Legal Cell for their endeavors to grow together and learn more. With this, we wrap up today's session. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tavishi, for bearing with us. Thank you, Gagan, for kind of getting me to do this and forcing me to read up on stuff which otherwise I would not have. So thank you. It's always good to kind of learn on stuff like this, and it pushes you to read a little more than you would otherwise put your mind to. Thanks a lot.
Thanks to Dusu Legal Cell for actually giving us this opportunity, and it's always an honor and privilege to be a co-panelist with Mr. Rao. So it gives me I'm not the same person who I entered with, so it always pushes me to the next level.
It works both ways. I think we've all grown wiser from the experience. Like I said, you're always learning, and this is something that I would not have otherwise probably paid as much attention to, but for this colloquium. So thank you so much again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining me.
Bye-bye. See you. Thanks a lot.